Hello everyone and welcome back to Military Aviation History. I'm your host Bismarck and I am at the Marine Museum in Den Helder in the Netherlands. Wargaming invited me to join their event celebrating the introduction of the first Dutch ship into World of Warships. World of Warships is a team-based free-to-play game featuring over 200 ships in which you can play as either a destroyer, a cruiser, a battleship or a carrier. Lone wolf or play with your friends in divisions, customize your ships and devise strategies to sink your opponents. Sign up to World of Warships with the link in the description below. All new players will receive 2 ships, including the premium German cruiser Emden, as well as a starting purse of in-game currency, doubloons and 7 days of premium. Today I want to talk about a very specific danger that all pilots shared during World War II. As if it wasn't enough that every day you must duke it out with enemy pilots. Make sure that you don't get lost, don't fly into a storm or have a mechanical failure. No, it turns out there is another danger out there that wants to make the life of a combat pilot a flying misery. I'm of course talking about these buggers right here, AA guns. Now nowadays you have surface-to-air missiles, and once everything is said and done, you really only need to press a button for the guy up there in the sky to experience a severe episode of Brown Alert. But early on, things weren't that simple. The AA gun appeared as early as aircraft were used in a military role. Even during World War I we see their introduction. We start out with the light machine gun and work our way up to bigger guns, essentially little different to the standard artillery pieces of the time. Quite a lot of work went into this as aviation became an ever more important aspect of warfare. To prevent bombers or recon aircraft from doing their worst, it was necessary to provide that ground-based defense. Not only does this allow you to shoot something down, but it also is great to push these aircraft to higher altitudes, and bombers, for example, will be less accurate at that point. So we see a lot of development during this time, and in fact the German 88mm heavy flak gun, perhaps the most well-known and recognizable AA piece of all time, can trace itself back to World War I. Ships also became the target for aircraft, not just via bombs, but also later with torpedoes. So it was necessary to arm them with AA guns as well. And we see some of this during the Great War and the interwar years, but ships tended to have only very few AA defenses. In World War II, initially, this became obvious. I am standing next to the 20mm Oerlikon. This gun was the standard light AA gun of the US Navy during World War II. It was compact, had a reasonable fire rate, good all-round characteristics, and could be used by a small team. As a Swiss interwar design, the Oerlikon saw service both in the Axis and Allied. Actually, some of the early Bf 109s had a gun that shared some of the family tree as this Oerlikon right here. In any case, the US Navy began to use these en masse in ever-increasing numbers, really. Whereas in 1941, much of the light AA suites were still centered around the 28mm Chicago Piano, which, well, let's just say it had some troubles, and the 50 cal M2, the 20mm Oerlikon offered a compromise solution with a better all-round package. The gun itself was improved in various versions over the years, but the overall use was the same. Rows upon rows of sailors littering the sky with shells. It really didn't matter if you couldn't aim. Volume of fire would have your back. The guns were supplied in 60-round drum mags, with the first 2 shells typically standard ball to clear out the gun barrel, and then you would follow up with your standard HE rounds. While initially gunners used the standard cartwheel sight, they also received the Mark 14 gyro. In the second half of 1942, the 20mm cannon actually accounted for 48% of US Navy anti-aircraft air kills, although this dropped to around 30% in the same time period in 1943, for reasons that will become apparent very soon. Talking about numbers, if you are actually interested in the sources for this video, they are linked in the description as with all my videos. Now let's assume that you have shot out your 60 rounds and you have to reload the gun. First of all, there are essentially 3 ways of checking whether there is still ammo in the drum. The first one is well, is the gun firing, yes or no? The second one is for the gunner himself. He can actually see in the back of the drum in a spiral sort of fashion how many rounds are still left. And up front you also have another catch here telling you how many rounds are still left approximately. Any case, to reload the gun, first of all, of course, we unload it. There's a latch here. Just press that all the way forward. Now you shove this part forward and you just latch it out. Now the empty drum weighs about, I guess, 5 kilos, maybe one could say, 4 to 5 kilos. So it's not light, but assuming there would be 60 rounds on there, it would be a lot heavier. So you chuck that away, you get the next one, you aim for the slit, latch it in place, and then it's going to go, there we go, and this chap is ready to fire once more. A 20mm cannon is good, but sometimes not good enough against determined opposition. So this is where this gun comes into play. It's the Swedish 40mm Bofors gun, and there is something about neutral countries and AA guns, I just don't know what it is. But in any case, the 40mm is perhaps my personal favorite AA gun of all time. It's effective beyond the range of the 20mm, which tends to only bring value when it's just about to be too late, and it looks like it means business and is deadly efficient. Now, securing production licenses for this gun for the United States it's a long story, I won't go into it for now, but suffice it to say the Brits and the US did actually produce the majority of the Bofors during the Second World War. Chrysler itself built like 60,000 of these and 120,000 barrels, which is quite an achievement given how complex this gun actually is. The gun came as it is here by itself, but could also be joined to double or quadruple mounts. Now generally it was water-cooled, but they also came in air-cooled versions, and the guns were used on nearly all US vessels, be it small minesweepers or a mighty battleship. Now the gun was operated by 2 men, one handling the traverse, the other one the depression. While firing, the gun would be continuously reloaded by 4 shell clips. As the gun fires faster than you could reload it, this might seem like a little bit of a flaw, but in practical application it really wasn't. Especially the double or quadruple mounts would always have at least 1 gun, maybe even 2 guns firing at the same time, so there was always ordnance on target. And let me tell you, when a 40mm HE shells hits a plane, let's just say Nigel is having a very bad day. But as a comparison between the 2 guns, the 20mm had an assumed hit rate of about 14% against a target going at 260 kph, which increased to 28% on the 40mm. Combat speeds, of course, were considerably higher, so take that with a little bit of grain of salt. And I gotta say, it's a pretty gun, but you have to be mighty small to operate it properly, because this is uncomfortable. A Bofors is not enough, you say. Well, I guess I can't please everyone, but sure, you can have one of these if you want them. This is a sort of dual-purpose gun that could be used both in naval engagement and as a heavy AA platform against aircraft. They came in much higher calibers than the Oerlikon and the Bofors. I mean, just look at it. Yeah, usually you had 3-inch 50 or even 5-inch. This is actually a 5-incher post-war, but hey, the caliber is the same. A hit and a plane goes down, and that's pretty much a manufacturer's guarantee. These guns were around before planes even existed, and on paper, while the 1 hit, 1 kill rating sounds pretty awesome, you really need to score that 1 hit in order to have success. And it being a breech loader, it won't fire as fast as a 20 or 40mm. So for a long time, this gun only had, well, limited potential as an AA platform. But things did get better with timed fuses. Based on continuous range estimates, the shells would hopefully detonate right next to an aircraft, littering it with shrapnels. And those explosions are the thing you see as black clouds in the moving pictures. But it still takes many shells to have that desired effect. And the US Navy actually assumed it had to fire 2,500 shells out of one of these guns in order to down a single aircraft. This is it, the 5-inch shell. As you can see, it's quite a big bugger. It's got a normal time delay fuse on it at the moment. And this would be roughly 40, 45, 50 kilos a piece. And these would actually be occasionally, quite often actually, hand carried to the actual gun. So yeah, just imagine that slugging around with one of these on the deck of a ship that is rolling and firing its guns, and yeah, it's no joy, but has to be done. During World War II, the Allies came up with something quite neat. Multiple nations worked on this, but yeah, in its application, after taking a look at what the British had done, the Americans really overshadowed everyone. And I'm of course talking about the VT fuse, and this is often translated as variable time. In the past, some have argued or speculated that this is a cover name, as it doesn't really explain the purpose of the fuse without you already knowing the concept. These shells were proximity detonated, meaning that they could, in the simplest of words, well, sense a plane, and were thus detonating right where the explosion and shrapnel will do the most damage. To do this, the shell had a small radio transceiver, complete with an amplifier and a capacitor. The projectile would fly towards its intended target, and radio waves from the transmitter would be reflected back by the target. And these, of course, then increase with closure and phase with the fuse-generated signal. And once the signal level is at that correct setting, the fuse knows that now it's time to go for a witness me, and the shell will detonate. The technology at work here is similar to what radar does, using the Doppler effect essentially. The drawback at this point is that, well, the fuses had to be of a certain size, so only larger calibers could use them, and not 20 or 40 mils at this point. And arguably the VT fuse was ready in 42, and a test showed that while it worked, there were still problems with the battery. You had to have wire power plant for the transceiver, of course, and then only about 70% of the shells would actually detonate in the end. But that's a pretty good number, but you still need to iron out some of the kinks. And a first seaborne test was conducted in August of the year, shooting the VT fuses at a couple of drones, and this was done on the shakedown cruise of the USS Cleveland. While most of the sailors were, still wet behind their ears, they did have experienced fire control officers. The test was meant to run for over 2 days. On the first day in the morning, 3 drones were sent out and the gunners took their aim. And they shot all of them down with only 4 shells fired. So with that kind of success, the VT fuses were put into production. The USS Helena was the first to fire VT shells in true combat conditions. On the 5th of January 1943, 4 Japanese aircraft attacked it and its task force. The light cruiser reloaded VT shells for her second salvo and soon scored a kill, downing a D-3A dive bomber. There were other improvements too. To give the crews flexibility, each twin 5.5-inch gun was given a short-range director. Thus, instead of all guns relying on a central director, their own short-range directors could engage targets independently, greatly increasing firing efficiency from all the guns. Under such conditions, the Navy even considered that a single twin-mount 5-inch gun was equal to 4 3-inch 50 or 2 quadruple Bofors. This wasn't added to all the guns, of course. The directors were slow to be adopted, but they did have an impact where they were being employed. But soon another problem presented itself that might seem like a little bit of a paradox. And it was. The shell, or the fuse rather, was effective. In fact, it was too effective. What if it fell into enemy hands and was reverse engineered? The Japanese had already done so with previous radar equipment they had found, so this wasn't pure paranoia. In 43, the initiative in the Pacific had changed. Midway, the year before, had made sure of that. But the Japanese were not beaten and still plenty of fight in them. And sometimes you hear that this was the reason why the VT shells were taken away from the sailors, that this was just for secrecy. But that's not the full picture. In 43, actually 9,000 shells, VT shells, were fired, credited with 50% of the 5-inch AA kills. And considering that 27,000 time-fuse shells were also fired during the same period, this isn't bad at all. And so, yes, way more shells were produced than made it to the front lines. In fact, 70,000 fuses could be produced in a single day. And yes, they didn't start rolling out to the front lines as quickly as they could have been, but they were being used, and to good effect. Some of you might be familiar with both the British and American CAP sorties, close air patrol, engaging Japanese aircraft long before they ever got close to a fleet. This proved to be quite efficient, thus you might question why all this hassle was made to improve AA fuses, AA shells. After all, Japanese attacks were broken up way before they even got close. That is true, but not the full picture. During the first 6 months of 1944, for example, around 300 Japanese aircraft still managed to penetrate the US CAP screen, and they attacked ships and transport vessels. Roughly 10% of these attacks scored hits or near misses, and about a third of the attacking planes were shot down by AA. Now sadly, I don't have any clear numbers on how many can be attributed to the VT Fuze, but we can assume that it was quite a few. Relying on cap alone, just as much as relying only on AA, was not the answer. You had to use both in conjunction to make the best possible defensive screen for your task fleet. And this saved many ships in the Pacific. Now with the war progressing on all fronts, the Axis power grew ever more desperate. In Europe you had the V1s, the buzz bombs, and in the Pacific you had the kamikaze. While the former was essentially a new weapon of sorts, a cruise missile in its infancy, the latter was particularly difficult to counter. Generally, you can rely on pilots exhibiting a certain sense of self-preservation. Even though many pilots throughout the war pressed the attacks home, even getting way closer than you might think is comfortable, there was always that expectation that a plane that was hit would just bugger off to fly another day. With the kamikaze, this was not so. You either shot it down or it got you. So you can see that at this point, a shell that doesn't need direct contact with the plane that's attacking comes in more and more of its own, and this increases the chances of a hit. This also caused a lacking of security measures to take place, with the defense of London, for example, also later on benefiting from the VT shell being used against the buzz bomb, the V1. Additionally, the shell was now also adopted in the artillery used during the Battle of the Bulge, for example. At this point as well, the US was also working proactively on developing a countermeasure to its own proximity fuse design. At least some quirky German scientists managed to get them working for Germany. Germany had actually worked on such a project for some years by now, but had never put these into production due to a lack of success before the war ended. Thank you very much for watching this episode, and I want to thank Justin and Trent for their help with sources for this video. As always, all sources are also linked down below. Thank you to Wargaming for sponsoring this episode, and to the Marinemuseum in Den Helder for their kind welcome and assistance, especially Curator Leon, who showed us around the depot. Remember to like, share and subscribe, and hitting that bell button. And as always, have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.
Navy Carrier Task Force steams into Japanese waters. Lookouts signal the approach of enemy planes, and anti-aircraft shells fill the sky.